Side 2. I insisted that this closer at this company let me look at the statements. We had quite a row, but finally I got to look at a copy. And I couldn't figure out one of the expenses that she had listed, and that was federal revenue stamps. Now, in those days, they figured them at $2.20 a thousand, or $1.10 for each $500 of the sale price. And her figures were quite a bit different than mine. So I questioned her about it. We had quite a row about it, and she acted like maybe I didn't know what I was talking about. So she insisted that that's the way they were going to close it, because she was the closer and they were the company that was handling the closing. And there was no other way about it. So I had to go along with them. Well, we closed the deal, and the money went into the inheritance, and later we were able to divide the money up, and along with some cash that he still had available, and each of the sisters got somewhere around $55,000, which was a lot of money in those days. In fact, you could buy 3 or even possibly 4 moderate houses with that amount of money. I wanted to express my feelings to both of these parties as to the fact that I wasn't happy with the statement, but thought I better leave it alone, and because we'd had enough problems by that time, and the difference was only maybe $50, $60 or whatever it was. Later I found out why she had, the closer had insisted on these figures for the revenue stamps. I knew one of the salesmen from this company, and at a real estate meeting many months later, I got to talking to him, and he was telling me how he had bought an apartment building on Marshall Avenue from the company. And I said, well, I asked him, what the address was and so forth, and he told me, and I said, well, I didn't know that you bought the property. I said, I knew it was sold because I was one of the agents that was handling it. And so then he explained it to me. Things started to make sense. The company that we were dealing with was not handling this thing legally. In fact, they were putting themselves in a position where they could have been put in jail. They were using a dummy person to buy the property when we were closing it. They had apparently already found a buyer for the apartment building on Dayton Avenue, and they had agreed to sell the building on Marshall Avenue to this salesman. However, between the two buildings, they were selling the property to them for somewhere over $150,000. Now, we had closed this deal on $110,000. So the company had done a little conniving and had the deeds drawn and made out to a fictitious person, And that person, of course, was one of the officers of this company. And as soon as we had closed it, they turned around and sold it to this other two parties and made themselves somewhere in the neighborhood of $40,000. And that is why the closer had put the figure in for the federal revenue stamps at a higher price, at a higher figure. The way it worked, if you wanted to go and check on what a property was sold for at the courthouse, you could go and look up the amount of revenue stamps that were put on the deed. The price was never put on the deed, just the revenue stamps. And then by figuring out how many revenue stamps were on the deed, you'd find out and what the sale price was. So she had faked it so that the sale price was going to be something like $150,000 or $160,000, so that if anybody wanted to check it at any time, it wouldn't look like they had fouled it up. Well, by now, of course, too much time had passed, and I had no way of proving that the company had pulled off this caper. But he also told me that the gal that had done the closing had absconded with $18,000 from the company, and the company wasn't about to do anything to her, and of course they couldn't, because they couldn't turn her in, because if they turned her in, had her arrested, she would tell the authorities what the company was doing. So here, this man from out west didn't trust me, so he hired the president of the real estate board in St. Paul to handle this so that it would be handled properly, and they got beat out of $40,000. During my career in the real estate business, I saw many transactions that were not actually above board. There were and still probably are ways for people to be dishonest, and it's very, very hard to catch them at it. Back in Minnesota, the laws in the real estate division were pretty strict, but it was real difficult to turn anybody in without sufficient proof of anything that they did that was actually illegal. The Board of Realtors had committees that would listen to various people that had grievances against some of the realtors that belonged to the board. And I was on the Board of Realtors at one time and had to listen to a lot of these grievances. At least two of the people that came before the board with grievances against them somewhere around 25 years ago are still operating in the St. Paul Board of Realtors. Some of the tricks that they pull are not absolutely illegal. They're just about as unethical as you could imagine. I have no idea why these people do this except for greed. And of course, some of them believe that if they don't cheat and be dishonest and handle things the way they think they should, that somebody else would do it anyhow. So what happens is when you try to run a business, a real estate business particularly, and be honest and above board and fair and square with not only your clients but with fellow realtors, it is very, very difficult. Many's the time that I had to give up commissions and listings in order to keep our office clean and above board while other companies were pulling different shenanigans. As I mentioned earlier, during the first several years that we were in business, I didn't have funds to do some of the things that I would like to have done. But as time went on and we became more successful and were making some money, and our reputation was good, we established a line of credit at the local bank. They were very good to me and would lend me just about any amount of money that I wanted to borrow, and they didn't even ask for collateral. So on occasion I did borrow from the bank. In those days maybe it wasn't much, but sometimes 10,000 or 20 or whatever. I could borrow up to 100 and even 200,000 if I needed it. However, I didn't often need large amounts. What I was doing was going on listings, and particularly people that wanted to buy another piece of property that I had for sale. The old way, and even today the way it's done, people will buy on a contingency. In other words, they see a house they'd like to buy and maybe enter into a contract and put some earnest money down, but it would be contingent on the sale of their house. So what I was doing was to guarantee a sale on a person's house if they were buying a house through my office. Now, of course, these were all local sales in the White Bear Lake area. On occasion, I did go out of the area to do this program, but most of them were in the local area. And what I would do is to find them a home that they liked, and if it was price was right and they could afford it and so forth, and we could put a contingency on it, contingent on the sale of their house. Then I would give them a guarantee on their house. And the way I would do that was I'd agree to list their house for sale at the maximum price that the market would bring at that time, and we would have that listing in effect for 30 days. If the property didn't sell within that 30-day period, then we would reduce the price to another agreed figure for another 30 days. And then at the end of that 30 days, we'd reduce it again, and if it didn't sell at that time, then we would have a price that I had agreed to buy it at. It worked very well, and I didn't have to buy very many houses because the market was quite good, and I'd usually get their property sold within the first 30 days, and then I could consummate the sale of the house that they wanted to buy. There were cases where I got involved in these types of guarantees where there was 2, 3, 4, even 5 houses involved. Later, knowing that that was working out quite well, I was approached by one of the big builders in White Bear, Bacchus Company, that built a few thousand houses, and they worked out an agreement with me whereby I would give this guarantee to people that wanted to buy a new house from them but had a house to sell. I would give them, the person that was buying the brand new house, the same type of guarantee that I was giving on these other sales, but Bacchus agreed to reimburse me for any of my losses. I worked that out many times, and it of course increased our volume of business. About the same time, I was selling a lot of homes to new teachers. The area was growing rapidly, and they were building new schools, and we were getting a lot of new teachers. And I started out with a few of these new teachers by financing them on their purchase of their first home. You realize a lot of them had just got out of college and didn't have a lot of money, and some of them even had families. So I would work out a deal with them where I would help finance them so they could buy one of the houses that I had for sale. I did that many times, and always came out on it. I don't remember that I ever lost any money doing that. It really was a good method of making sales. I did that type of financing and selling for a number of years. Probably bought 25 or 30 or so houses during that period of time. Usually I was able to resell those houses that I had bought within a reasonable time. And there again, that's where the bank came in. They would lend me the money to buy these houses with when I needed the money. Oftentimes all I needed was a few $1,000s just to buy down to the mortgage balance. There were probably hundreds of people that in the White Bear Lake area that worked at Minnesota Mining Company, and they called that the 3M Company. And a lot of those people were in very good jobs and were subject to transfer to some of their other plants all around the country, and even various places in Europe and even in Asia. And they were had, of course, then would have to sell their houses. I was on a Boy Scout committee with some of these fellows that worked at 3M, and 2 of them were going to be transferred, both about the same time. Now, 3M had used a St. Paul company, real estate company, to do most of their sales on these transfers. At least they recommended them, and the people would usually go along with who the company recommended, and they'd try to get a reliable company that they could recommend. Well, the company they were using wasn't doing too well in the White Bear Lake area. So these two fellows that I was on a committee with asked one of the officers at 3M, the Personnel Services Department, if they could list their houses with me. And they gave them permission. And again, you know, as I said, we were kind of lucky and doing well at that time, and sold both of those houses within a week or so. Well, that made an impression with the 3M company, the main man there, and he called me one day and wanted to meet with me, and I met with him, and he asked me, he said, how would you like to handle all the transfers in the White Bear Lake area? Well, there was only one answer for that, of course. I was just tickled pink. So after that, and for many, many years after that, when someone was transferred that lived in the White Bear Lake area, they would recommend that they list their house with my office. For several years, that business amounted to about a third of my total business. And of course, if you'd sell one house, you'd usually get two more, and if you sold those two, you'd get four more, and so on and so forth. So it really was a bonanza for me. A lot of those people, as I said, were transferred over to England and Belgium and France, Germany, Italy, all over. And what I would do is when we'd get the sale prepared, I would send the documents overseas to have them agree on them and have them signed and send them back. And then I would represent them at the closing and get their money, and then I would send their money to them wherever they were. Worked out very, very well. On one occasion, I had been showing houses to a young couple that wanted to buy, and they were looking for a fairly substantial house. And I had two in particular that I thought they might be interested in. Both of them were vacant houses. Now, this was in the middle of the winter. We had a lot of snow and ice and so forth. And I had a fella that would plow the driveways in my empty houses, and sometimes he would shovel the snow to the front door, but not too often. Well, a few days after I'd shown this couple some houses, they called me and they said the fella, the girl, it was a girl, the girl's mother and father were in town and for a short period of time, and they kind of liked to show them around and at these houses that I had showed them, and I was sure that they were looking for some financing from the folks. So I agreed to pick them up, and I did, and we went to this first house, and the driveway wasn't plowed, but I had snow tires on, and I could go up and down the driveway with my snow tires. Snow was about 3 feet deep, and got the car into the driveway, and then I got my shovel out and I shoveled the snow up to the front door so we could get in. And this fellow, of course, I said, was coming from out of town, and he didn't have any overshoes, so he kind of appreciated that. And then I took him to another house and did about the same thing. Well, the mother of this girl would walk around with the couple, and I was walking around with the father. And he was a very quiet, seemed kind of unconcerned, laid-back fella, real nice guy. And of course, my job was always to try to make an impression on people. And finally, as we were walking around, I asked him where he worked. And he said he worked at 3M, and just kind of dropped it. And so I said, I know a lot of people at 3M. What department do you work in? he said, overseas. And so I started naming off all these people that I had sold for that were all over the world. And, I thought it was pretty smart. And then I said, what do you do at 3M? Well, he says, I'm the president of International. Well, I just about bit the end of my tongue off because here he was one of the biggest men in 3M, and I'm trying to impress him, and I became very humble, believe me. And later, I was lucky enough to sell that young couple a house. But I guess at times I did get pretty cocky because we did have a real good business, and things were going our way. About that time is when I had, of course, Jim Langer working for me. I mentioned previously that I bought quite a few houses along the line, and was able to sell most of them, but I did get stuck with some of them. I think at one time we had 5 of them that we couldn't sell for various reasons. The market was bad and so forth, and we had to just rent them out. One of them in particular was kind of interesting. I could write a book on that one, but to be brief, what happened was this. One of the local merchants was a friend of mine, and I owed him some favors, and he got some business for me and so forth and so on. Asked me to go and see his mother-in-law's house and see if I could do anything about selling it. Told me up front that they were in very bad financial position, and the house wasn't in too good shape, but to please do whatever I could for him. So I went to look at the house, and he was right. The place was not in good shape at all. Neither were the people. They were both alcoholics and had no money, owed everybody and his brother. They owed on the house, and the company that they owed the money to really couldn't foreclose on them because they owed so much, and there was so many liens and judgments against them that the mortgage company really couldn't come out by foreclosing. So they had lived there for many years, but the last couple of years they hadn't even made a payment on the house. Well, as I said, I could write a book on it, but to make it short, about the only thing I could possibly do to help these people out was to buy the house. Well, the way I bought it was to figure out what was owed on the mortgage, plus all of these other bills and judgments and liens that they had, and add up the total and come to a figure as to what it would cost me to buy it. As I stated before, this was really more than the house was worth, and it needed a lot of repair. But because I felt obligated to this fellow, his dad had been a personal friend of my dad's, and they'd done a lot of favors for us, and for a lot of reasons I felt obligated. So I put package together and presented it to this fella and this couple, and of course they agreed to take it because they could get out of hock. Of course now they didn't have a house to live in, but he found them someplace to rent. Well, it was something. Really something. There was 3 rooms downstairs and 2 bedrooms and bath upstairs, and it was on well water even though it was in the city, and it had a septic tank. Again, here it was in the city, and over the next few years I had to hook up the water and sewer and have the house repaired, windows, doors, cabinets, carpeting, painting, roof, all sorts of things, and I got quite an investment in it. So I really couldn't sell it because I'd take quite a beating, so I just rented it out for quite a few years. And then because of inflation and so forth, after a period of time, we were able to sell it, and I think we broke even on it. But that was quite an experience. There were other properties that we had to buy for various reasons other than the guarantee, and some of them we came out on okay, and others we lost a little bit, but that was part of doing business in those days. One time we did quite well on a property that we bought, considering the prices. This was a small house on a 100 by 300 foot lot on County Road F. The back of the lot was on the lake shore. It was called Goose Lake. Now, Goose Lake at that time was part of the sewage system from White Bear, so it wasn't any place you could swim or anything like that, but it had some beauty to it because you could look across the lake, and if you didn't know it was for sewage, why, it wasn't bad. The gentleman, elderly fellow that I listed it for, asked me to get $6,000 for it, so I tried it for $6,000 for some period of time, and then later it didn't seem to sell. So he suggested that maybe we drop it to $4,000. Even at $4,000, I couldn't seem to get anybody interested in. I was reasonably sure that in the future it would have a lot of value, so I approached some investors from White Bear, men that owned a lot of other properties and so forth, and tried to tell them that I thought it would be worth some money someday, but they just weren't interested in it. So I had it for maybe 2 years, and then one day the old gent said to me, well, why don't you buy it? I didn't have any money at that time, and I said, well, I just don't know that I could. And he said, well, you could have it for the $4,000, and I'd even pay you a commission. Well, what I did was ask one of the savings and loan companies that I had been doing business with to come out and give me an appraisal on it. And they came out and they agreed to lend $3,400 on the $3,000. So we were going to be able to buy it now for $3,600 because the commission was 10% on this type of property, and the sale price was $4,000, so $400 off of that made $3,600, and I could get a $3,000 mortgage. So I went to my brother-in-law and asked him if he would like to put up $300, and I'd put up $300, and we'd buy it, and he agreed to that. So we bought the property and rented out this little house. It didn't have city water, it didn't have city sewer. It was just kind of a shack-like, but we rented it for like $100 a month, I believe it was. And we got enough out of it to make the mortgage payments, just about, and had it for a couple of years. And in the meantime, the Chevrolet garage from White Bear bought the property adjacent to us and put up their new facility where they sold new cars and repaired old cars and so forth. And actually, they weren't right next to us, but their parking lot was right next to us. Well, after they'd been there a year or so, one of the men that worked for him came over and indicated maybe he'd like to buy it and try to sell it to his boss. Well, he didn't have any money, and so that didn't work out. But I went to see his boss several months or a year later, and he said, well, no, he didn't think he was interested in it at all. Well, nothing came of that, and then one day he called me back and wanted to know what we wanted for it. Well, by this time I had an offer of $15,000 if we could get it rezoned. Well, that's a long story. We couldn't get it rezoned, so that deal fell through. But now I thought, well, as long as I had one offer at $15,000, maybe it'd still be worth that much if this man could get it rezoned, because he had property adjacent to it. So I said, well, the price is $15,000, and you assume the assessments. There was about $3,000 assessments I got against it. Well, no, he didn't think that was a very good deal. Didn't sound like a decent price to him. So I said, well, that's okay. I'm not in any hurry to sell it, but the arrangement that we have made in our own minds is that each year that it goes by, it's going to be worth more. So each year we're going to raise the price $5,000. And he kind of laughed, and I said, yeah, well, that's what we're going to do. So time went by, and I think it was the following a year after that, in December, he called me up one day and asked me to come over to his office. I went over, and he said, well, I'm interested in buying that property now, and maybe we do some negotiating. And I said, well, we don't have to do any negotiating. I said, you know what the price is, and you know the terms and so forth. And he said, well, I hate to pay $15,000 for it, but if I have to, I have to. And I said, well, gee, you don't remember. I said, I told you each year would go up $5,000, so now it's $20,000. Well, no, he says, I wouldn't be interested in that. So I said, it's okay. No, next year it'll go up another $5,000. Well, about a week went by, maybe 2 weeks. It was getting close to the end of the year, and he called me up and he said, you better come over and get a check. Well, I went over there, and he had agreed now to go to the $20,000 because a week later it was going to go to $25,000. So I drew up a contract, and the only bad part of it, as far as we were concerned, was that he snookered me a little bit. He said, I don't want to close. I'll give you $1,000 now, but I don't want to pay off the balance until July of next year. Well, I talked to Bob about it, and he said, that sounds good. So we sold it to him for $20,000. Well, we got all through paying off some of the expenses and paying off the balance on the mortgage. Bob and I each came out with around $9,000, and we'd only gone there with $300 apiece. So it turned out to be probably as good an investment as you could make at that time. With the experience that I had in real estate, I was able to do a few things for our church. The first time was early on when I was working for Art Thome. The church was located on the corner of South Shore and Belair. The house next to us on Belair Avenue was owned by some people in Chicago and had been rented. The renters came to the church and minister and said that he had a chance to buy the property, but he didn't have the money and he just would like to rent it. But he wondered if the church might be interested in buying it. Now the price at that time was, if I remember correctly, $11,500, and he needed $500 to start the negotiations. It would be used as a earnest money payment. So he agreed that he would allow us to take his option and go ahead and buy the property. Well, he called me in and said, how could we go about doing this? And I said, well, first thing we could do is come up with $500. Well, the Treasury didn't have $500, so I said, well, let's get some of the more successful people in the church together and we'll raise the $500. So we called 4 of the businessmen, and I met with them, and we went over it, and I said, how about if we each put in $100? Well, there was no interest in it. Nobody wanted to put up $100. So it looked like maybe the deal was going to go down the drain, but I went to my boss, Art Thome, at the time, and fortunately he was a Lutheran and kind of active in his church, and I explained the deal to him, and he said, well, that's no problem. He says, I'll give you the $500 to use for earnest money, and in fact, I'll draw all the documents for you if you'd like. It won't cost you a dime. So I went back to the church and council, and they thought that was great, so we went ahead and I got some financing through one of the loan companies and through church extension and so forth and so on, and we purchased the property. And then, of course, after we placed a new mortgage and that, we were able to pay Mr. Thome back his $500. Well, shortly thereafter, another property was behind this house on another street, but adjacent to our church property. And the same thing came up there and tried to raise the $500. Nobody came up with it, so then my boss came up with the $500, and we did the same thing on that and purchased that property and paid him back. Well, we used those, after renting those properties out for some period of time, we used them then for Sunday school. And then when they decided to add on to the church, why we had to get rid of these buildings. Well, I sold one of the buildings off the property, and the other one I moved myself, or at least contracted to have it moved. I bought a lot a few blocks away and contracted a fellow to move it, and some people to put in the basement and the garage floor and so on and so forth, and I got volunteers from the church to help do all the repairs and put on a new roof and paint it and decorate it and landscape it. And then when we got it ready, I sold it for the church. It seemed to me that I got $10,500 for it, which helped to pay back the original mortgage that we'd had on that property. Then later years, quite a few years later, a piece of property came up across the street, a vacant lot, and through some negotiations I was able to acquire that for the church. And then later there was a property across the street in the other direction which faced White Bear Lake. It was a big house, and it's too long a story to tell about it, but there was a Jewish couple that owned it and just came there in the summertime, and they got to know our minister real well, and for whatever reason they donated the entire property to our church. It was very complicated. There was money involved, but they used their trust account to pay the church, and the church paid the people, and we got the property at no cost to us. We used it as a parsonage for many years, And later, when the pastor got his own home, I sold that property for the church also. So over a period of years, it was kind of fun working out all these little deals for the church, and I enjoyed it. One of the things that was kind of interesting for me was that I was appointed commissioner in condemnation a few times. A condemnation procedure acts like this. Some governing body needs a parcel of land or pieces of property along a right-of-way to make a road wider or put in a park or build a school or whatever it is. And they negotiate with the owners of the property, and if that doesn't work, then they put the property under condemnation. They condemn it. And by condemning it, then they have to have appraisers on their side, and then the sellers or the owners have to have appraisers on their side, and commissioners have to be appointed, really judges, and usually it's 3 commissioners, and when this is all consummated, then the appraisers for the both sides appear before the commissioners, and after and they present their figures as to what they think the property is worth, and then the commissioners have to go back and make all the comparisons and decide what the final price for the condemnation will be. And that's notified, all parties are notified, and the seller has 30 days to contest it, and if he doesn't contest it, why, of course, then the award is made and the property is taken by the governing body. It was very interesting to be a commissioner in these proceedings because I got to learn a lot and got to meet a lot of people, and it was extremely interesting and worthwhile for me to do this. As I mentioned earlier, I was in the real estate business for about 35 years total. And you can imagine how many stories I could tell about various transactions during that period of time. But I'm sure that it would get kind of boring after a while, and only people that were extremely interested in the real estate profession would even want to hear any more stories. But over the years, of course, I met thousands of people, some for a short period of time, some I spent weeks or months working with, buyers and sellers, lawyers, doctors, investors of all kinds, appraisers, commissioners, bankers, mortgage brokers, savings and loan officials. Worked with all sorts of buyers and sellers. We worked with widows, widowers, with divorce cases. I worked with gays. Worked with all sorts of good and bad people, you might say. But most of the people that I worked with were good people. I had occasion to work with convicts. I had to go into jails a few times to have documents signed I had to meet with administrators of estates. Certain sales involved people who had committed suicide. Some was, one time it was a murder-suicide. And I served as administrator of estates, as expert witnesses in divorce cases in court, and expert witness in condemnation proceedings. I was a notary public for 40 years, and appeared in court for various reasons on several occasions. I got to know a lot of people and made a lot of friends. My education was limited, but I learned most everything about the real estate business just through trial and error and through experience. However, I did attend several different colleges, short-term courses in accounting, taxes, appraising, real estate courses, and they were all very helpful. And then I also belonged to and was active in many organizations, the White Bear Lake Chamber of Commerce, the Lions Club, Boy Scouts, Explorer Scout committees, church committees, real estate committees and boards, and then I sponsored bowling teams and participated by bowling on some of the teams myself. And so I spent a lot of evenings working or going to school. Of course, all of this was not easy for Charlotte because she had a lot of work to do at home and a lot of responsibility for raising the family. In about 1975 or 76, I bought a Century 21 franchise. Franchises were fairly new at that time, and they had seemed to be very successful. Jim Langer and I were the only ones in the office besides Dolores Pepin, our secretary. So we weren't doing an awful lot of business. But we joined Century 21, and within a short period of time, we started hiring salespeople. And before, maybe 2 years, we had just about tripled our business. It was very good for a long period of time, and then, of course, some of the other large companies had to try to keep up with the Century 21 system, and they started doing more advertising and expanding, and some of them were selling out to big companies such as Merrill Lynch and Prudential. And this, of course, changed the market around, and after 6 or 7 years, the market kind of subsided, and with the competition that we had, our business went way down again. Of course, so did everybody else's, and a lot of companies closed down. And finally, after a real bad year, I had to close down also. Just to give you an example, our expenses had been somewhere around $10,000 a month. I had been able to cut them down to about $7,000 a month. But in 2 of the months that year, our total income was $150. So you could see that things were not going real well. One of the other agents who had a fairly successful company, and he was a good friend of mine, asked me if I would like to come to work in his office. And of course, I was getting kind of close to retirement at that time anyhow. I was 62, so I decided that would be a good move for me, and closed my office and went to work for him. I was with him for a year or two, and then he sold out to another big company, and I went along with them to this big company, Edina Real Estate. His company had been Keller Corporation. I stayed with Edina for a couple of years, even though I really didn't do much business with them. Winters we spent most of the time here in Florida, and I wasn't as active as I probably should have been. But it was a good experience to be in that Century 21 program, and again, we had some real good years. While I was working for Edina Realty, it was a Twin City company that covered all the Twin Cities and the suburban area. It was the largest family-owned real estate company in the United States. At that time, they had 1,100 salespeople. You could get lost in that company real easily. There were a few occasions where my buying pieces of property, either because of guarantees or for investment purposes, had a direct effect on our family. One of the properties was located on Homewood Avenue in White Bear. It was a nice rambler, 3-bedroom rambler. I bought it from Jack and Nancy Hoffner so that they could buy another piece of property that I had for sale. Kathy and Mike and Pat were living in Wichita at the time, and Mike was still in the service. Was about to be discharged shortly, and Kathy came home on a vacation and was looking for a place to stay when they got back. And it was just about the time I was buying this property from Jack and Nancy. So I showed it to her and told her that she and Mike could buy it from it if they'd like, for the price I had paid for it, and I would carry the paper on it until they got established, and they decided that that might be a good place for them. It was a real nice house. So I kept the house for them until they got back from Wichita. And then they moved into the house and lived there for quite some time. In fact, if I remember correctly, Brian was born when they lived there, and it was great to be able to see the kids so close, because as I'll mention a little later on, we had built a house fairly near there, and the boys could almost walk over with an adult with them, of course. And it worked out real good, and then they decided to move to Forest Lake because Kathy had got a position as a teacher there, and it was quite a drive. It was about 15 miles one way, and of course in the wintertime that was a lot of driving in the snow and ice, so they decided to move up there and sold the house in White Bear for them, and they came out quite well on it, I would say. Also, I had bought a house in White Bear on 4th Street. This particular house I had taken and bought because of a guarantee I had made, and had sold these people another house, and this house didn't sell, so I bought it. And Tom and Carol got married, and when they did, I sold them that little house, and they really liked it. And of course they didn't have much to start with, so it was going to work out real good for them. Tom especially liked the yard, and he had lots of flowers and vegetables, and he really enjoyed it. He likes being outdoors anyhow. And it had a pretty substantial sized garage, which Denny used to keep store a lot of his stuff in too, which was a big advantage for him. But then of course Tom couldn't keep his car in the garage. But then after a few years, Tom and Carol got divorced, and I bought the house back from them. Later I bought another piece of property which we built on, and I'll tell you more about that in the next tape.